Everyone's heard of the Sten gun. Most people who know anything about World War II have at least a passing familiarity with it. That cheap, crude, ugly little submachine gun the British churned out by the millions. The one that looked like a plumber had a bad day and accidentally invented a weapon. The one that jammed. The one that fired when you didn't want it to and refused to fire when you did. The one that Allied commanders sometimes called an embarrassment and resistance fighters supposedly tolerated because they had no better options. Except that last part isn't true. Not even close. Because here's what the official story leaves out. The Sten gun wasn't just tolerated by resistance fighters across occupied Europe. It was preferred. Actively, deliberately, passionately preferred. Over better weapons. Over more expensive weapons. Over more sophisticated weapons that took longer to make, cost more to produce, and were specifically designed with elite combat operations in mind. When given the choice, a significant number of resistance fighters across France, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Poland, and beyond chose the Sten. They asked for more of them. They built their own illegal copies of them in secret workshops hidden under floorboards and behind false walls. They memorized every single fault and quirk. Everyone's heard of the Sten gun. Most people who know anything about World War II have at least a passing familiarity with it. That cheap, crude, ugly little submachine gun the British churned out by the millions. The one that looked like a plumber had a bad day and accidentally invented a weapon. The one that jammed. The one that fired when you didn't want it to and refused to fire when you did. The one that Allied commanders sometimes called an embarrassment and resistance fighters supposedly tolerated because they had no better options. Except that last part isn't true. Not even close. Because here's what the official story leaves out. The Sten gun wasn't just tolerated by resistance fighters across occupied Europe. It was preferred. Actively, deliberately, passionately preferred. Over better weapons. Over more expensive weapons. Over more sophisticated weapons that took longer to make, cost more to produce, and were specifically designed with elite combat operations in mind. When given the choice, a significant number of resistance fighters across France, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Poland, and beyond chose the Sten. They asked for more of them. They built their own illegal copies of them in secret workshops hidden under floorboards and behind false walls. They memorized every single fault and quirk of the design and worked around each one. They carved out a relationship with this weapon that went so far beyond simple utility that historians still argue about what it actually means. And if you think you already know this story, I promise you don't. Not fully. Not the part about why the Sten worked when everything about it suggested it shouldn't. Not the part about how underground machinists in occupied territories reverse-engineered it from scratch. Not the part about the specific failures that turned out to be features. Not the part about what this weapon reveals about the nature of irregular warfare itself. Stick around, because this is one of those stories where the more you dig, the stranger and more fascinating it gets. And if you want more stories like this one, go ahead and subscribe right now. We do this regularly. And this one, I think, is going to surprise you. Let's start at the beginning. And to really understand why the Sten became what it became, you have to understand what Britain was facing in 1940. Not just the strategic picture, which was obviously catastrophic, but the industrial picture, which was arguably even worse. Dunkirk happened in late May and early June of 1940. The numbers are staggering even now. The British Expeditionary Force evacuated roughly 338,000 troops from the beaches. That part gets remembered and celebrated, correctly, as a miracle of improvisation and courage. What gets remembered less clearly is what they left behind. Approximately 63,000 vehicles, around 2,500 guns, something in the neighborhood of 76,000 tons of ammunition, and somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 rifles, along with tens of thousands of Bren guns, anti-tank rifles, mortars, and virtually every other piece of heavy or crew-served equipment the BEF had taken to France. Britain had just evacuated its army and left its weapons on the beach. And this wasn't a theoretical shortage. This was an immediate, terrifying, practical crisis. Churchill's government was genuinely considering the possibility of a German invasion. Home Guard units were drilling with broomsticks. Serious proposals were being discussed about arming civilians with pikes. The country that had industrialized the world and built an empire spanning a quarter of the globe was looking at its own defended shores and wondering how it was going to arm the people standing on them. The standard British service weapon at the time was the Lee Enfield rifle, which was a masterpiece, genuinely one of the finest bolt-action rifles ever made. But a Lee Enfield took time to manufacture. It required skilled machinists, careful fitting, precise tolerances. You couldn't just spin them up overnight by telling a factory that normally made something else to start making Lee Enfields. The tooling was specialized. The training for the workers was extensive. The production timelines were measured in months, not weeks. What Britain desperately needed was something that could be made fast, made cheap, made in enormous numbers, and made using the simplest possible manufacturing processes so that factories without specialist weapons experience could produce it immediately. The solution came from two men whose names deserve more recognition than they typically get: Major Reginald Shepherd of the Royal Arsenal at Woolwich and Harold Turpin, a designer at the Enfield facility. Their surnames give us the ST and the EN in Sten. The gun was conceived and designed in a matter of weeks, which should tell you something about both the urgency of the situation and the nature of the design philosophy involved. Because Shepherd and Turpin weren't trying to make the best submachine gun ever designed. They were explicitly, deliberately trying to make the most producible submachine gun ever designed. Those are fundamentally different engineering goals, and understanding that difference is the key to understanding everything that comes afterward. The Sten Mark I appeared in 1941. Its specifications read like something out of a deliberate exercise in austerity. The body was made from steel tube. The barrel was a simple cylinder. The magazine fed horizontally from the left side, which was unusual and which would cause some of the weapon's most notorious reliability problems, but which also simplified the design considerably. The stock was a bare metal skeleton or a simple wooden plug, depending on the variant. There was no pistol grip in the traditional sense on the earliest version. The trigger mechanism was about as simple as any functional firearm mechanism could possibly be. The total parts count was astonishingly low. Some versions of the Sten could be disassembled into fewer than 50 components. The Thompson submachine gun, which was the American alternative that Britain was receiving through Lend-Lease, had over 100 components in some configurations. The MP40, its German equivalent, was a more refined piece of engineering. The Suomi KP-31, which the Finns had used to devastating effect against the Soviets, and which represented the state-of-the-art in submachine gun design, was a beautifully made weapon that required skilled manufacturing. The Sten was none of those things, but what it was manufacturable. A skilled worker at a reasonably equipped workshop could produce a Sten in approximately 5 man-hours. The materials required were mostly low-grade steel, brass, and basic springs. The tolerances were deliberately loose, which meant that slightly imperfect parts could still function together. The tooling required was minimal by weapons manufacturing standards. By mid-1942, British factories were producing Sten guns at a rate that would have seemed impossible 18 months earlier. The Mark II, which became the most widely produced variant, could be made for somewhere between 2 and 5 British pounds, depending on the facility and production run. That is not a typo. 2 pounds. At a time when a Thompson cost somewhere between $45 and $50 to produce for the American military, which translated to roughly 15 or 16 pounds at wartime exchange rates, the cost differential was enormous. Britain eventually produced somewhere between 4 and 5 million Sten guns across all variants. The exact number is difficult to pin down precisely because production was distributed across so many different facilities, but the scale is unambiguous. This was mass production in the most literal sense. And then someone had an idea that changed everything. Someone in British Special Operations, in the organizations that would become the Special Operations Executive, realized that a gun this simple to manufacture wasn't just cheap to make for Britain, it was cheap to make for anyone, including people in occupied territories who might be willing to fight the Germans if they had weapons to fight with. The SOE was formally established in July 1940, with a mandate that Churchill described with characteristic bluntness as setting Europe ablaze. The organization's job was to support, supply, equip, and coordinate resistance movements across occupied Europe. And from very early on, it became clear that the weapons question was central. You could parachute agents into occupied territory. You could establish networks of couriers and radio operators. You could coordinate with exile governments in London. But if the people on the ground didn't have weapons, they couldn't fight. And if they couldn't fight, most of what the SOE could offer was ultimately symbolic. The initial approach was to supply resistance movements with existing British military weapons, dropped by parachute in containers. And this worked, to a point. Lee Enfield rifles, Bren guns, Welrod pistols, various explosives and demolition materials. These all found their way into resistance hands. The Welrod, in particular, was a remarkable silenced pistol developed specifically for covert operations, and it remains one of the most effectively silent firearms ever made. But there were problems with the supply approach. First and most obviously, aircraft availability. RAF Bomber Command was not wildly enthusiastic about diverting heavy bombers from strategic bombing campaigns to fly low and slow over occupied territories, dropping containers for partisans. The aircraft that were available for special operations flights were limited, the risks were substantial, and the weather over Europe was an enemy that no amount of bravery could fully overcome. Supply drops were irregular, unreliable, and always inadequate to the scale of what resistance movements needed. Second, there was the problem of what happened to weapons after they arrived. Resistance fighters weren't operating from fixed bases with secure armories. They were hiding weapons in farmhouses, burying them in fields, stashing them behind false walls in urban apartments. Weapons got discovered during German sweeps. Weapons got lost when networks were broken up by arrests. Weapons were used up and couldn't be replaced through normal supply lines. The attrition rate on resistance weapons was brutal. Third, and most importantly for our story, there was the question of local manufacturing. If resistance groups could make their own weapons, the supply problem became much less acute. They wouldn't be dependent on the vagaries of RAF scheduling and channel weather. They could scale production to their needs, rather than hoping that what arrived in a container was sufficient. They could replace losses immediately rather than waiting weeks or months for the next drop. And this is where the Sten's design simplicity stopped being a military embarrassment and became a strategic asset. Someone at the SOE looked at the Sten specifications and realized something remarkable. This weapon could be made in an occupied country, not by a major factory, which would immediately attract German attention, but by a small, dispersed network of workshop machinists, each producing individual components that could be assembled elsewhere. The parts were simple enough to make without highly specialized tooling. The tolerances were loose enough that small variations between components wouldn't necessarily prevent the weapon from functioning. The materials were common enough that they could be sourced without triggering obvious German supply chain monitoring. The SOE began distributing Sten drawings, specifications, and manufacturing guidelines to resistance networks. And here's where the story gets extraordinary, because those networks responded with a level of ingenuity and dedication that still reads as almost unbelievable decades later. Let's talk about Denmark first, because the Danish case is one of the most thoroughly documented examples of clandestine Sten production. Denmark was occupied by Germany in April 1940, in an invasion so fast and so overwhelming that the Danish government made the decision to cooperate rather than fight a battle they could not win. This produced a genuinely complicated occupation dynamic that was different from what happened in France, the Netherlands, or Poland. For the first couple of years, Denmark maintained a degree of administrative autonomy that was unusual among occupied countries, and the German occupiers were initially careful to present the occupation as relatively benign. But by 1943, the situation had shifted dramatically. Resistance activities increased. German patience with Danish autonomy decreased. In August 1943, the Germans imposed direct military rule, and the Danish resistance entered a new and more active phase. The Danish resistance needed weapons. The SOE was supplying what it could, but demand far exceeded supply. And so Danish workshop owners, mechanics, machinists, and craftsmen began doing something remarkable. They started making Stens. The Danish clandestine Sten production is notable for several reasons. First, the quality. Underground Danish manufacturers weren't just making rough functional copies. Some of them were making weapons that were in certain respects better than the British originals. Workshop owners who had spent their professional lives maintaining machining tolerances far tighter than anything the Sten required brought that precision to their clandestine production. Some Danish copies of the Sten had smoother actions, tighter fitting components, and better surface finishing than the wartime British originals, which were deliberately made to minimum acceptable standards. Second, the organization. The Danish production wasn't random. It was coordinated, with different workshops producing different components that were then assembled at separate locations. This was deliberately designed to limit the damage if any single part of the network was compromised. A workshop making barrels didn't know who was making receivers. A workshop making magazines didn't know where the final assembly was happening. Classic cell structure security applied to industrial production. Third, the scale. Historians estimate that Danish underground workshops produce somewhere in the region of several thousand Sten guns, with some estimates going significantly higher. For a resistance movement operating in a small, heavily occupied country with an active German security apparatus, that is a staggering achievement. And the Danish story, while particularly well documented, was not unique. Similar clandestine production of Sten guns or Sten-inspired weapons took place in Norway, in parts of France, and perhaps most impressively of all, in Poland. The Polish case is almost incomprehensible in its ambition and its tragedy. Poland's experience of occupation was uniquely brutal. Germany and the Soviet Union had divided the country between them in 1939. The German occupation in particular was characterized by a level of deliberate mass murder that exceeded anything seen in Western Europe. The Polish population was categorized as subhuman by Nazi racial ideology, and German policy in occupied Poland operated accordingly. Against this backdrop, the Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, emerged as one of the largest and most sophisticated resistance organizations in occupied Europe. At its peak, the AK had somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 members. It operated its own intelligence service, its own courts, its own educational system, its own communication networks, and it had its own weapons production capability that was astonishing in its scope. Polish underground arsenals produced a remarkable range of weapons. They made Vis pistols, the excellent Polish service pistol that had been in production before the occupation. They made flamethrowers, they made hand grenades, they made anti-tank weapons, they made improvised armored vehicles for the Warsaw Uprising, and they made Sten guns, lots of them. The Polish version of the Sten was designated the Błyskawica, which means lightning. And while the Błyskawica was technically a different design from the Sten, being a Polish underground original rather than a direct copy, it drew heavily on the same principles and incorporated Sten magazines. But alongside the Błyskawica, Polish workshops also produced direct Sten copies, and the volume of production from underground Polish facilities represents one of the most remarkable feats of clandestine manufacturing in the history of warfare. To understand what this took, you have to understand the risk involved. Getting caught with a weapon in occupied Poland was a death sentence. Not a metaphorical one, a literal death sentence, often extended to the person's entire family, and sometimes to their neighbors. The Germans were not subtle or proportionate in their response to resistance activity. They were deliberately, explicitly brutal as a matter of policy, because they believed that sufficient terror would eliminate resistance. They were wrong. But the courage required to operate an illegal weapons workshop under those conditions is genuinely difficult to comprehend. The people doing this work knew exactly what would happen to them if they were discovered. They did it anyway. And why were they making Stens? Because the Sten could be made. Because its simplicity was achievable with the tools and skills available in the underground. Because a more sophisticated weapon would have required capabilities they didn't have. The Sten's crudeness, the very quality that made it an embarrassment to conventional military thinking, was precisely what made it viable for this extraordinary purpose. Now let's talk about why resistance fighters preferred the Sten, because this is where things get genuinely counterintuitive. The preference wasn't just a matter of availability, though availability obviously mattered. When resistance fighters had access to multiple weapons and could make choices, they often chose the Sten. Let's go through the reasons. Size and concealability. This is the first, and in some contexts, the most important factor. The Sten Mark II, the most widely used variant, was just over 76 centimeters long, with the stock extended. With the stock folded and the barrel removed, which could be done without tools and took about 10 seconds for someone practiced with the weapon, you had components that fit easily inside a coat, a bag, a briefcase, or a toolkit. The horizontal magazine added some width, but could itself be detached in seconds. For a resistance fighter who spent the vast majority of their time not in combat but in the occupied city where they lived, where they moved, where they were constantly subject to German checkpoints and identity document inspections, this mattered enormously. A Lee-Enfield rifle was simply impossible to conceal. A Bren gun was crew-served and completely impractical for urban covert operations. The Thompson, while excellent in many respects, was heavy and bulky by comparison. The Sten could disappear. Stories of resistance fighters moving through checkpoints with Sten components, distributed between themselves and their companions, with barrels hidden in trouser legs or receivers tucked under coats, appear repeatedly in the memoirs and testimonies of survivors. The gun's ability to be quickly disassembled and distributed wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate design feature that happened to be extraordinarily well matched to the specific requirements of underground warfare. Silencer compatibility. The Sten was remarkably easy to silence. Not perfectly silence, because no firearm is truly silent, but reduced to the kind of noise level that wouldn't immediately identify itself as a gunshot from any distance. The Sten Mach-IIS was a specifically silenced variant, developed for SOE and commandos, but field-expedient silencers could be and were constructed for standard Sten guns by resistance fighters with basic machining skills. This was critically important for a specific type of resistance operation that was fundamental to the strategy of underground warfare: targeted assassination and direct action against individual collaborators and German personnel. These operations required that the sound of gunfire not immediately bring every German security element in the area down on the operatives. A silenced weapon gave you time, not a lot of time, but enough to walk away before the alarm was raised. The particular acoustics of the Sten being fired with a suppressor, which produced something between a cough and a sharp knock, rather than the unmistakable crack of a gunshot, are mentioned specifically in SOE training materials and in the accounts of operatives who used the weapon for this purpose. The Germans knew it too. The presence of Sten Mach-IIS weapons in particular was associated with specific types of targeted operations, which led to German security forces being particularly focused on tracking down suppressed weapons. The caliber question. The Sten fired 9mm parabellum. This was the same caliber used by the German Luger, the German MP40, the German MP38, and a wide range of German sidearms and service pistols. This was not a coincidence from the SOE's perspective. Supplying resistance movements with weapons that could use captured enemy ammunition was explicitly part of the logic behind the caliber choice. For a resistance fighter, this was genuinely significant. German ammunition was everywhere in occupied territories. Wehrmacht and SS units carried it. German police units carried it. Supply depots contained millions of rounds. A resistance group that ran short of ammunition for their Stens could in principle resupply from German sources, either through theft, capture, or purchase on the black market. A resistance group running short of .45 ACP for their Thompsons had no comparable option, because American pistol caliber ammunition was simply not present in occupied European supply chains. This ammunition interoperability sounds like a minor logistical detail. It was not. In the reality of resistance operations, where supply was always uncertain and always inadequate, the ability to maintain operational capability by drawing on enemy ammunition stocks was potentially the difference between a group that could keep operating and one that had to stand down. The Sten's caliber was in this specific context a significant operational advantage. Reliability and context. Here is where the established narrative about the Sten gets most interestingly complicated, because the conventional wisdom is that the Sten was catastrophically unreliable, and this requires some unpacking. The Sten did have reliability problems. They were real, they were documented, and they had genuine consequences. The horizontal magazine was the primary source of most of them. The magazine design was directly borrowed from the German MP28, and while it was functional in principle, it was sensitive to how it was loaded and how clean it was kept. Double feeding malfunctions, where two rounds tried to enter the chamber simultaneously, were a known issue. The lips of the magazine, the part that controlled how rounds were presented to the chamber, were easily deformed by rough handling, and deformed magazine lips were a major cause of feeding failures. There was also the notorious tendency of some Sten guns to fire when dropped or struck sharply. This was a function of the simple open bolt firing mechanism. The bolt was heavy, and if the weapon was dropped in a way that drove the bolt forward with sufficient force, it could chamber and fire a round. This killed and injured people. It happened during training. It happened in the field. It was one of the Sten's most serious and most legitimately dangerous flaws. But here's what the conventional narrative misses. Resistance fighters knew about these problems. They studied them, they addressed them, and once you understood the Sten's quirks and managed them properly, the reliability picture looked considerably different. The magazine issue, for example, was largely manageable through discipline. Load the magazine to 30 rounds and it would jam. Load it to 28 rounds and it was dramatically more reliable. This was well known among experienced Sten users, resistance fighters who had been trained by SOE instructors, who had read the technical materials that came with SOE supply drops, or who had simply learned through experience, knew to stop at 28. They knew to keep the magazine lips clean and undented. They knew to maintain the magazine more carefully than any other component. The open bolt safety problem was addressed through training and the use of simple mechanical solutions. You didn't carry a cocked Sten with a round chambered unless you were about to use it. Period. You kept the bolt in the forward, uncocked position until the moment of use. This required discipline, but resistance fighters operating in environments where a negligent discharge could get them killed and compromise their entire network developed that discipline very quickly. And against the specific threat environment resistance fighters faced, which was not sustained combat at range against organized military units, but sudden, close-range violent encounters at very short distances, the Sten's performance characteristics were actually quite well matched. It fired from an open bolt, which meant it was less prone to cook-offs in sustained fire than closed bolt designs. Its cyclic rate of around 500 rounds per minute was actually on the lower end for submachine guns, which made it more controllable in short bursts. Its range was adequate for the distances at which resistance operations typically occurred, which was usually inside a building or across a narrow street. Now compare this to what the alternatives actually looked like in practice for resistance fighters. The Thompson was a heavier, bulkier weapon. It fired .45 ACP, which, as we discussed, was logistically awkward in occupied Europe. It was more expensive and harder to produce locally. Its reliability was generally better in sustained combat conditions, but for the specific use cases of resistance operations, those advantages mattered less than the disadvantages. French and Dutch resistance fighters who received Thompsons often found them difficult to conceal and logistically complicated to keep running. The Bren light machine gun was superb as a light machine gun. It was accurate, reliable, and hard-hitting. It was also a crew-served weapon that required a dedicated gunner and at least one assistant, was heavy and bulky, and was completely unsuited to the kind of individual-level covert operations that made up the majority of resistance activity. Resistance groups were delighted to receive Bren guns for specific operations, particularly ambushes of German convoys or attacks on fixed positions. But a Bren was not a personal weapon for day-to-day underground operations. The well-rod pistol was excellent for its specific purpose, which was single silent shots at very close range for targeted assassinations. But it was a single-shot weapon that required manual cycling between rounds. You could not fight your way out of a compromised situation with a well-rod. For the assassination of a specific individual in a controlled setting, it was perfect. For the general personal defense needs of a resistance operative, it was insufficient. The Sten sat in a sweet spot that none of these alternatives occupied. Light enough to be practical for individual carrying, concealable enough to pass through checkpoints when disassembled, using ammunition available from German sources, capable of local production, providing enough firepower for the violent close-range encounters that resistance operations involved. This is why experienced resistance operatives who had the choice preferred it, not because it was the best submachine gun by conventional military metrics, but because by the specific metrics that mattered for their specific operational reality, it was the best available option. Let's talk about some specific operations where the Sten played central roles, because the abstract strategic analysis only tells part of the story. The details of actual operations illuminate the Sten's place in resistance warfare in a way that statistics and specifications cannot. Operation Anthropoid. This is one of the most famous and most significant special operations of the entire war, and the Sten gun is at the center of it in a way that is sometimes lost in the telling. Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubis were Czech soldiers who had escaped the German occupation of Czechoslovakia, made their way to Britain, and volunteered to return to their occupied homeland on a mission to assassinate Reinhard Heydrich. If you know the names of senior Nazi officials, you know Heydrich's, because it was one of the most feared names in occupied Europe. Heydrich was the Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia. He was the architect of the SD, the Nazi Intelligence and Security Service. He had chaired the Wannsee Conference that formalized the planning for the Holocaust. He was known by various terrible names, including the Butcher of Prague and the Hangman. Churchill's government and the Czechoslovak government in exile had concluded that assassinating him would be a significant blow to Nazi leadership and a demonstration that the long arm of the resistance could reach even the highest levels of German authority. Gabčík and Kubis, parachuted into Czechoslovakia in late December 1941. They spent months making contact with the local resistance, establishing safe houses, studying Heydrich's routine, and planning the operation. The plan they settled on involved attacking Heydrich's staff car at a hairpin turn in a Prague suburb where the driver would necessarily have to slow down. On May 27, 1942, it happened. Heydrich's open-top Mercedes-Benz came around the curve. Gabčík stepped into the road and raised his Sten gun, and the Sten jammed. This is the moment that every account of Operation Anthropoid lingers on. The primary weapon, the weapon that was supposed to end Heydrich's life cleanly and quickly, failed at the critical moment. Gabčík stood in the road with a jammed Sten, while Heydrich's driver, flustered, brought the car to a stop rather than accelerating away, which was a fatal error. Kubis, who was covering from a different angle, threw a modified anti-tank grenade that landed near the rear of the car. The explosion injured Heydrich severely. He died 8 days later from his wounds, which were complicated by sepsis. The operation succeeded. Heydrich died. But it succeeded in spite of the Sten's failure, not because of it. And yet, and this is the part that requires some careful thought, the Czech resistance's response to the Sten's failure at Anthropoid was not to abandon the weapon. It was to double down on magazine discipline and maintenance protocols. The investigation into the malfunction concluded that it was a magazine problem, almost certainly a combination of a slightly deformed magazine and less than ideal ammunition. The lesson drawn was not that the Sten was unusable, but that the Sten required specific maintenance and loading practices that had not been followed perfectly in this case. This response tells you something important about how experienced resistance operatives understood the weapon. They didn't expect perfection. They expected a tool with known characteristics, known failure modes, and manageable requirements. The Sten met that description. And in the context of an operation like Anthropoid, where the team could not carry heavy weapons, needed to be able to approach the target area without attracting attention, and needed a weapon that could be quickly deployed, the Sten was still the right choice. The failure was in execution, not in fundamental suitability. Let's look at France, because the French resistance experience with the Sten is extensive, complex, and in some ways even more illuminating than the Czech and Polish cases. The French resistance was not a single organization. It was a constellation of different groups with different political affiliations, different operational approaches, different geographic areas of operation, and different relationships with the Gaullist exile government in London and with the British SOE. The communist FTP, the Francs Tireurs et Partisans, operated largely independently of the London-connected networks. The Maquis, the rural guerrilla groups that emerged in the hills and forests of southern and central France after the German occupation of the previously unoccupied zone in November 1942, were diverse in their composition and command structures. SOE Section F, the independent French section of the SOE that operated networks without necessarily coordinating with de Gaulle's organization, supplied a large number of circuits across France, and the Sten was the primary personal weapon supplied to these circuits. The accounts of SOE agents operating in France during this period are remarkable reading, and the Sten appears in almost all of them. Francis Suttle, who ran the Prosper network in northern France, reported that his circuit had received over 100 containers of weapons by mid-1943, with Stens making up the bulk of the personal weapons. Pearl Witherington, one of the most effective SOE agents in France, who eventually commanded a Maquis force of several thousand men in central France, relied heavily on Sten-armed fighters for her circuit's operations. The specific operational use of Stens in France tracked closely with the patterns we see elsewhere. Assassination of collaborators and German security personnel, attacks on rail infrastructure, often requiring operatives to fight through German security, ambushes of German convoys on rural roads, raids on German supply depots, the liberation of resistance members from German custody. For all of these operations, the Sten's concealability was consistently reported as a significant practical advantage. Moving through occupied French cities required passing through German and milice checkpoints. The milice was the French collaborationist paramilitary organization that was in some respects even more feared by the resistance than the Germans themselves, because its members knew the local population, spoke French, and could identify suspicious behavior patterns that German soldiers might miss. Moving while carrying a weapon through an environment where the milice was actively looking for resistance members was a serious operational challenge. And French resistance operators again and again chose the Sten for this task because it could be made to fit inside civilian clothing or luggage in a way that no comparably capable weapon could match. There's a recurring story, in various forms, in multiple French resistance memoirs, of a fighter crossing a checkpoint with a Sten barrel hidden in a wrapped loaf of bread, or a Sten receiver tucked alongside tools in a worker's bag. These anecdotes may or may not be literally true in every case, but they reflect a consistent operational reality. The Sten's disassemblability was used, regularly and deliberately, to move weapons through German-controlled checkpoints. French underground production of Stens also occurred, though not at the scale seen in Denmark or Poland. Several cases are documented of French workshop owners producing Sten components, particularly in areas where the Maquis had developed sufficient control of territory to operate small manufacturing facilities with relative security. Now let's spend some time on what the Sten was being compared against in the specific context of occupied Europe, because the comparison isn't always what you'd expect. The Germans had their own excellent weapons in occupied territories. Wehrmacht soldiers carried K98K rifles, MP40s, and various captured weapons. German security forces and Waffen-SS units had access to the full range of German small arms. The MP40, in particular, occupied a similar tactical niche to the Sten, being a submachine gun firing 9mm ammunition. And here's an interesting comparative note. Resistance fighters who managed to capture MP40s generally kept them, valued them, and used them. The MP40 was a better engineered weapon in almost every conventional sense. Its magazine fed vertically downward, which was a more reliable configuration than the Sten's horizontal feed. Its folding stock made it almost as concealable as the Sten when folded. Its mechanism was smoother and more forgiving of marginal ammunition. But capturing MP40s was difficult and dangerous, and the supply was never remotely adequate to equip resistance forces at scale. The MP40 was a German weapon for German soldiers. The Sten was a weapon the resistance could actually get in quantity. And in the mathematics of resistance warfare, having enough weapons matters more than having perfect weapons. The Sten's production scale meant that by the mid-war period, resistance movements across Europe had been supplied with a personal weapon in numbers that simply could not have been achieved with any other design. The RAF dropping operations into France alone delivered tens of thousands of Sten guns across hundreds of sorties. Poland received thousands more. Scandinavia, the Low Countries, Greece, Yugoslavia, they all received Stens in quantities that would have been impossible with more sophisticated weapons. And there's one more comparison worth making that almost never appears in discussions of this topic. Compared to no weapon at all, the Sten's faults were completely irrelevant. This sounds obvious when stated, but its implications are important. A significant number of resistance fighters who received Sten guns would otherwise have had nothing, not a better weapon, not an equivalent weapon, nothing. The choice was not Sten versus Thompson or Sten versus MP40. In many cases, the choice was Sten versus working with whatever improvised alternatives were available, which might be a single-shot converted hunting rifle or a revolver taken from a dead collaborator. Against that baseline, even a Sten gun that required careful magazine management and gentle handling was a transformative operational capability. Let's look at the different variants of the Sten, because the weapon's evolution through the war years tells its own story about what mattered to the people using it. The Mark I, as we've discussed, was the original. It had a wooden forward grip and a flash hider, which sounds like refinements, until you realize that the SOE was already asking for something simpler and lighter. The Mark I was produced in relatively small numbers before the redesign. The Mark II became the iconic version, simpler than the Mark I, lighter. The barrel could be removed quickly by rotating a collar, which is how the weapon could be broken down so rapidly for concealment. The trigger group could be removed as a unit. The Mark II was specifically designed with clandestine operations in mind in a way the Mark I was not, and the difference in design philosophy between the two versions reflects the SOE's influence on the weapon's development. The Mark I IS was the suppressed version. This was purpose-built for the SOE and for commandos, fitted with an integral suppressor that replaced the standard barrel and outer tube assembly. The suppressor worked by venting gas progressively through a series of baffles as the bullet traveled down the barrel. It was effective enough to reduce the gunshot to something comparable to a firm handclap, though it was most effective with standard velocity ammunition rather than high-velocity loads. The Mark I IS was used extensively in targeted operations where noise discipline was essential. The Mark III was a further simplification of the design, made from even fewer parts and using even simpler manufacturing processes. If the Mark II was cheap to make, the Mark III was almost absurdly cheap. The stamping dies and welding jigs required to make a Mark III could fit on a workbench. This was the version that underground manufacturers found most accessible, because its simplicity reached a point where basic workshop equipment was genuinely sufficient. The Mark V was the final wartime variant, and it represents an interesting reversal of the design trend. By 1944, with production capacity well established and some improvement in materials and quality control, the Mark V incorporated a proper pistol grip, a wood stock, and a bayonet lug. It was heavier and more expensive than the Mark II or III, but it was also more ergonomic and in some respects better made. The Mark V was issued more widely to regular military forces, while earlier Marks continued to dominate resistance supply. There's also the Canadian Long Branch variant, which was produced at the Long Branch Arsenal in Ontario under license. Canadian production of Stens was substantial, adding to the total numbers available for distribution. The Long Branch guns were generally well regarded, made to slightly tighter tolerances than some British wartime production examples, reflecting the slightly different manufacturing environment. Now let's talk about what resistance fighters said about the Sten in their own words, because primary source testimony is ultimately the most direct evidence we have for understanding the preference. The memoirs and oral histories collected from European resistance veterans contain consistent themes. The concealability comes up constantly, as we've discussed, but there are other recurring observations worth examining in detail. Simplicity of operation is mentioned frequently, and this connects to something important about the nature of resistance movements. Resistance fighters were not professional soldiers. Many had little or no military training before joining. A weapon that could be explained and mastered in a short time was genuinely valuable in an organization that couldn't provide extended training periods. SOE training courses for agents were intensive but short, measured in weeks. Resistance members in the field often received their basic weapon training during brief contacts with SOE agents or from other resistance members who themselves had only limited formal instruction. The Sten's mechanism was simple enough that basic safe operation could be taught in an hour. Field stripping and cleaning could be demonstrated in minutes. A weapon that took less time to learn to use safely was directly valuable